There is a certain depth required for a story to reach the point where everything feels like the natural reaction to what came before. A story where you can't really feel the pull of the author's hand. And when it comes to Mushoku Tensei, that depth comes from how well it explores the theme of change. Just because characters develop over the course of a story doesn't mean the story is exploring how people change, much less to the level of Mushoku Tensei. I'd say it's no exaggeration to claim that change is at the very core of this story, as it's not only a major aspect to a select few main characters, but something that extends to the whole cast and the world itself. And as popular as the theme of change is to explore, I wouldn't say that it's often portrayed very effectively. We tend to see a lot of stories tackle the development of its world and characters as either a linear process, or as a collection of outbursts that enact immediate change on who a character is. But in Mushoku Tensei, Rifujin no Magonote showcases an ability to craft believable change, by allowing his characters to feel as natural extensions of the world we are presented with. There's something to be praised in a work that develops a character by gradually swapping out each piece of the puzzle that makes them whole. And that is what really makes it stand out, as the process of change isn't driven by singular moments. This is not to say that there aren't any tipping points, realizations, or emotional outbursts, but instead that change in these characters occurs gradually over long periods of time through the accumulation of many different experiences. People don't change overnight, and while it might be hard to understand in what ways they are changing in the moment, when looking back it's easy to connect the dots and make sense of how it came to be. And episode 17 is a perfect example of how we get to see this. Based on all his experiences in both this life and his last, Rudius comes to a realization that makes him better understand Paul's outburst from the day before. And this is in no way some drastic change for him. It's not as if Rudius had never shown the ability to empathize with others before, but this is how to show growth in a way that feels very natural. It's not linear, it's not smooth, it boils down to a bunch of experiences and reflections that might not even seem related, and in some ways even conflicting, but when looked at retrospectively, enable us to better understand how they turned into who they are today. And while the growth of Rudius can sometimes be hard to notice, as it's a slow process occurring right in front of us the whole time, if you look at some of the episodes from early in Season 1, you'll be able to see how much he has already grown. And you might also notice the more turbulent aspects to him, like how his lack of confidence turns to arrogance as everything seems to go right for a while, and then back again to self-doubt. There's a certain internal conflict that makes him much more believable to us, and most characters that appear more than once are given this kind of treatment. Over the course of the show, Aris has become a much different character from who she was when we first saw her. And while you could point out to the kidnapping as a singular moment of change for her, even though this is a moment that affects her deeply, afterwards she slowly reverts back to her former self. This is one of the ways in which characters grow in Mushoku. After each event that evokes a great emotional response, they go through a phase of adopting this new experience into their former self, and by the end this leaves them to come out as a slightly different person each time. Much like how a wound turns to a scar, it might fade but it will still leave a mark. And so, over time it only becomes harder to point out to specific moments as being the sole reason for change. And the same applies to character relationships, like how the bond between Ares and Rudius slowly turns from animosity to attachment, not from a moment alone, but based on all the experiences they shared. And while so far I've only mentioned the two characters we have seen the most of, the same applies to the rest of the cast. Just briefly, Paul is someone you could try to point to as having one moment define his change. The teleport incident. However, as we see from the flashback at the start of episode 17, it was more of a slow degradation of his mental state as he slowly starts to lose hope, and not an overnight change. And we see the same applied to every recurring character. They neither stay stagnant when off-screen, nor are they defined only by what we are made aware of. They get to live and experience things on their own, even if we don't get to see them. And tied to it all is the change in the world itself. The Six-Face world, as it's called, wasn't completely shaken by the teleport incident. It adapted and moved on. There's no over-dramatization of this event, where everything and everyone in the whole world was deeply affected. And yet, it isn't something that lacks consequences either, as this is no longer the same world we were first introduced to. To stay on the analogy I used before, the teleport incident was a wound that faded and turned into a scar. While many authors have tried to categorize the dichotomy of writing styles, my favorite version comes from the author of A Song of Ice and Fire, who divides it into architects and gardeners. And looking at the way this story was crafted, Rifujin no Magonote would most likely fit into what George R.R. Martin calls a gardener. And I've brought my friend Feign over to quote Martin's definition.
The architect plans everything in advance. He draws up his blueprint. He knows where the plumbing is going to run, he knows how many rooms there are going to be, and exactly what the square footage of each room is. Everything is finalized before you dig the first hole in the ground or drive the first nail. The gardener, he may know the general shape of the garden that he wants, but still, he is digging a hole in the ground, he is planting the seed. And he has some kind of idea what is going to come out. The gardener knows whether he is planting an oak tree or whether he is planting a radish, so it is not totally random, but is the oak tree going to be a healthy oak tree? Is it going to be windblown? Is lightning going to strike it? There's a lot that goes to chance and to other elements with the gardener. The garden is a living thing, and I think it's the same for writers. All writers are a mixture of both, but some lean much more heavily to one side.
While I wouldn't call either a superior method, I would say the first has a tendency to make for more concise stories, in which every aspect is there to build towards the intended result, while the latter tends to favor the natural growth of its world and characters, over any particular intended result or message. And while I'd say the architect's way of building a story is better suited for exploring most themes, due to the author having more control over every aspect of the story, I'd say the theme of change is one of the few that are more suited for the writing of a gardener. And the Six-Face world came across like Rifujin's garden. I'd say he really fits into that description of a writer based on how the characters are allowed to make decisions according to their backgrounds and traits, more so than for the progression of a grander narrative. He lets them grow and change naturally as they adapt to the world around them. And of course, behind the scenes he's directing their growth, as any gardener is bound to have his tricks. He is aware that plants tend to follow where the light is, and is capable of trimming and placing support stakes to guide them towards his vision. And I'd say this style of writing is also what allows Mushoku Tensei to feel similar to a slice of life at times. Placing interesting characters in a setting where they're allowed to grow naturally tends to make for an interesting story by itself. Such is the appeal of shows like Oregairu, Spice and Wolf Monogatari, and so on. It comes from how the characters interact and how their relationships as well as their self-perception changes over time. And I'd say all of that applies to Mushoku Tensei as well. Say, would any of you be surprised if Rudius and Ares ran out of supplies and had to stop on a peaceful city and work on a tavern for a little while, and we would be shown how that kind of work conflicts with Ares' pride, or how Rudius is always getting distracted looking at her? Because I don't think I would even bat an eye. And this focus on personal change and growth of these characters over the progression of the main plot makes it so that arcs can swiftly change in both tone and content without it feeling like it's straying from the path of the story. Mushoku Tensei has been blowing away all expectations I set for it ever since the first episode back in January. It truly showcases a living world filled with characters that are ever adapting to new circumstances in ways that align perfectly with their experiences. It really set the bar for how to change and develop both its characters and the world they inhabit. And I'm well aware this isn't even the tip of the iceberg. I really fell in love with this series over the last year, and it's quickly becoming a favorite of mine. So if you've reached this far, comment Zenith is best girl just so I know who made it all the way to the end. Also, if you want more Mushoku Tensei content, there's a few others in my channel for you to check out. Or go check out my friend Yuri comparing the anime, manga and light novel to try and figure out what the best medium for Mushoku Tensei is. And of course, I'd also like to thank Feign for being a part of this video. So without further ado, I'm Ayvhel, signing out.